Good morning, Derek. 2 nights ago, I had my final linguistics class of the term. All that's left is for me to take my final exam. And it got me thinking about my interest in linguistics and how I could sum that up for you, because it's a lot to take in. There's a lot of detail and nuance. So I thought I'd take the time to make a video and give you 5 reasons why I'm a fan of linguistics. Reason number 1, linguistics and the brain. I'm a big fan of the birthright of being human. You know, when you're human, you're born with some pretty cool stuff. You are born with a certain level of pattern recognition. You're born with 5 senses. You're born with the ability to process information in some pretty unique ways. And all of this is due to the machinery that's in the brain. One could argue that it's in our DNA as well, but the brain is sort of where we live as beings. And the brain is where we learn how to speak. Now, of course, the brain is where we learn how to speak, but I learned in both my linguistics class and my psychology class that the brain actually has a separate method of learning for language. Professor Noam Chomsky, the linguistic professor at MIT, theorized that human beings have a language acquisition device, part of the brain that picks up language in a completely unique way to any other kind of learning. So language actually exists in a separate part of the brain. It winds up lateralizing in the brain in different ways. So the first reason I'm interested in linguistics is that it has its own special VIP access card in the way we learn, and I think that's really cool. Reason number 2, language and the mind. So if the brain is the house we live in, the mind is everything inside that house. It's the people, it's the dog, the curtains, the air molecules, the radio waves, the plumbing. It's everything sort of that's undefinable and categorical. It's all there. Now we know that the words we use can affect how we speak. We know, for instance, that if you grow up in a house with very liberal parents who hate Republicans, you will learn to view Republican as a bad word. You will develop a cognitive bias. We also know that the words you use can affect how you look at new meanings. For example, if you're someone who's lived your whole life without ever hearing of the concept of utilitarianism, one of my favorite philosophies by John Stuart Mills, just the introduction of the word and learning what the word means can expand your mind to new ideas and new thoughts, and those new thoughts will lead to new ideas, and new ideas will lead to new philosophies. So, in addition to changing how we think, words can actually expand how we think. The introduction of a new word can completely change the way we interact. I don't know if that would also be considered a cognitive bias, but this is sort of commonly known. That's already fascinating. But get this, in addition to developing a cognitive bias, let's say that you didn't grow up in a house where Republican was a bad word. You grew up in a tribe that had 23 words for the color green. You could tell every tree, plant, leaf, grass type in a 10-mile radius just by the shade of green that it appears in. But you have no word for the color blue. You actually won't see blue. You will see the sky as perhaps a shade of white, maybe yellow, but absence of use of a specific word has actually been shown to affect how people differentiate colors. And not only can it affect what shades you see, it can actually affect seeing the color at all. So language has a direct effect on the mind and thoughts. Reason number 3, language and story. I'm a big believer that stories are as much a part of what it is to be human as our genes, our brain, our biology. There's something about storytelling. It's how we communicate. And language is, of course, how that happens. So language is an integral part of storytelling. It was the creation of language and the ability not just to learn how to read and write, but to learn how to recount that allowed us to create culture in the first place. Knowledge didn't have to die with one generation. You could draw a picture. You could tell a story. You could create a piece of technology and pass down, and that became cumulative, and all of culture came about. There's another specific way that language affects storytelling, and that is the theory that writing, which became, in my opinion, the most important technological achievement of the human race, that writing is in of itself a kind of speech. We talked about this very briefly on the phone, the theory that writing is known as frozen speech, and that there really is no difference between speaking and writing. It's just a question of how are you getting the words out there. So linguistics has a major impact on storytelling, which is basically the beginning and the end for me. Reason number 4, linguistics and science. Linguistics obviously is a branch of science, but it has an interesting relationship with science. This one is a little more complicated, but bear with me. I think you'll be able to get this. There's a theory in linguistics called the theory of mind. It is the understanding that when we communicate, we have consciousness, and we are assuming that the person we're talking to has consciousness too. There's no way for us to know this for sure. But when I say apple, you have an entire understanding of that word. A color, a taste, a feeling, a sensation, perhaps a relationship. You love the taste, you hate it, you're allergic to it. You almost choked to death on one when you were a kid. You love baking apple pies. That word activates a whole level of thought in your mind that goes beyond the word itself. The word is not the thing. The word is what allows me to communicate thought from one mind to another, because I'm not psychic, and neither are you. I can't put my head against yours and just think it at you. So I have all this stuff swirling around in my head, the theory of mind. How do I communicate it to you? Words. Words are not reality. Words are not thought. Words are how we bridge the gap of thought. This is also true of science. The things we discover in science are not reality. The law of gravity is just a mathematical equation, the theory of gravity, I should say, that explains why the universe behaves the way it does. That doesn't mean we won't someday find something that contradicts it. Scientific theory and scientific law have to evolve with the reality that is observed. And in that same way, language is only a placeholder. So I appreciate the fact that language and science both represent temporary bridges for us to connect one reality, whether it's the reality of the universe or the reality in our head, to another reality. Reason number 5. This is the most poetic of all the reasons. I learned something very interesting in the lesson about bilingualism. I learned that adults whose brains have already formed, this is called the end of brain plasticity. It occurs around the start of puberty. There are some theories that say it actually ends around 9 years old, others say 14 or 15. But once brain plasticity ends, your ability to pick up languages, whether a first language or a fifth language, starts to taper off. Learning a language becomes work. For adults, it's one of the reasons why it's so hard for adults to learn new languages. Once this happens, let's say you learn a translation. I can't remember the name of door or window in Italian. La finestra! Your brain is actually using more space for this because your brain is understanding that there is window and there is finestra. And even though they mean the same thing, your brain also has to store translation. This means this in this language, this means this in this other language. It's a translation. Children whose brains have not stopped developing don't store translations. A child that grows up in a bilingual home doesn't understand that finestra and window are the same word in two different languages. It understands that it's two words that mean the same thing. Most people are not bilingual from birth, but imagine an entire classroom, creative writing or poetry classroom, full of children who have command of 2 or 3 languages and no concept of translation. This means that when they write their poetry, they have twice as many words at their disposal to convey the idea. They can mix and match rhymes, they can mix and match imagery and rhythm, they can code switch from one language to another, and this opens the door for a tremendous amount of artistic, poetic license, where the second language stops becoming a separate language and starts just becoming an extension of the core language you learned. There is a political movement, I haven't heard much about it, but I've talked to a friend of mine about it, sort of connected to this, that suggests that the official language of America We don't have an official language. We all know it's English, but we don't have one on the books. The idea is that we make an official language, and we make that language American. What that would mean is that the official language of the United States is a combination of English, as it has evolved in America, and Spanish. This would mean that all signage would be presented in English and Spanish, but it would also mean that words that have become part of English or part of Spanish after the mother tongue was severed from England and Spain would also be considered part of it, because there are a ton of words we use in English and in every other language that were not originally part of that language. And accepting American as the core language would not only instantaneously include a large majority of Spanish speakers, almost half the population at this point, but it would allow for the continual evolution of English with web speak, text speak. Any trends that caught on would not have to be this separate thing. Ebonics, which has been proven to be a valid language with grammatical rules, would all of a sudden be considered proper English. You wouldn't have this classist, elitist separation, and you also wouldn't have people being left behind because there was no way for them to learn how to understand these languages. You'd have access to learning how to speak Ebonics, how to speak Spanish, because it would be considered part of the same universal language. Those are just 5 reasons: the brain, the mind, story, science, and art, why I think linguistics are really fascinating. I've only just been studying it for about 6 months at this point. We started in my psychology class over the summer, and I just did a linguistics class. I'll say this, like any scientific field, it can get rather dry. So I'm probably not going to go into linguistics on its own. My interest is more cosmological. I'm interested in the ways that they connect. And linguistics seems to be sort of a linchpin between biological evolution, brain function, and the creation of culture and the creation of art. All of them swirl around this ability for human beings to create language, to learn language, to pass language on. Get rid of linguistics. We have no science, we have no art, we have no technology. We quite possibly have no civilization. And that doesn't mean get rid of English or get rid of the written word, because sign language is a part of linguistics. Lexicograms are a part of linguistics. And we're not the only creature that can learn language, but we seem to be one of the only creatures on the planet that can develop our own language, and we are certainly the only creature on the planet that has developed language to this complex a level. Fun fact, apparently dolphins gossip and have names for each other, but that's a story for another time. So this was an experiment in a longer video. My hope is that because I actually had a point and wasn't just rambling trying to connect A to B to C loosely, I had a purpose, that it wasn't that hard to listen to. I'm not going to go back and record a second one, so 13 minutes and 30 seconds. Let me know what you think, and there's more videos on the way. Talk to you later.